So at this point, I want to introduce David Carmichael, who is the state archivist for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the author of Implementing the Incident Command System at the Institutional Level, a handbook for libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural institutions. So David, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn everything over to you, and I'm looking forward to your program.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. I am going to ask your indulgence for just a second. Let me make sure that I'm getting the slides up so that you can see them. And then I'm going to hide my video to save some bandwidth here. And so you won't be seeing me, you'll see my picture where I look younger anyway. So let me do this, and I'll ask Naomi to make sure that I have got the slides up.
Yep, your slides are up. Your screen is good.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to discuss the incident command system with you. So I'm going to be saying ICS a lot. So let's just establish at the beginning that I'm talking about the incident command system. The incident command system began in the 1970s when, as often happens, California had major wildfires, and they were probably the worst in modern times in 1970, and they've gotten worse since then, of course. But the October 1970 fires drew 20,000 responders from 500 separate agencies, and it was chaos. All of these agencies came with their own management structure, their own way of tackling the problems, their own acronyms. So it was like putting 20,000 people together who spoke 500 different languages and answered to 500 different monarchs somehow. And so, as you can imagine, it was just total chaos. And so under a federal mandate, they came up with, California started what eventually became the incident command system that is now used internationally to respond to agencies. And I always say that the incident command system is a temporary management structure. It supersedes that of the responding agencies. It is highly standardized, and it does not follow a normal management pattern. I can tell you, it is very, very military. So if you have 500 agencies responding, they each leave their own management structure at the door. They leave their acronyms at the door. They leave their job titles at the door, and everyone fits into ICS. And so during a crisis, it is a very good tool to use to manage a crisis. ICS standardizes the positions in an organization, the responsibilities that each of those positions bear. It standardizes the facilities, it standardizes everything. It even standardizes acronyms that you're supposed to be using so that everybody's speaking the same language. So why should you care? If you are a cultural organization of some sort, there are a couple of reasons you should care. One is it is used on scene. If you have a disaster or an emergency at your repository, the people who respond are going to use ICS in their response. If they do not set up a full-blown ICS structure in the response, they're still going to be informed by ICS. They're going to be thinking the way ICS has trained them to think. And as you'll see as we go on, that will help you as the victim repository to talk to the responders and get them to understand what you need, and you will understand what they need. It is multi-jurisdictional, so that no matter who comes, if they come from many different jurisdictions, they'll all be speaking ICS, as it were. There are internal reasons also. ICS scales way up. It is what is used, it was used to respond to Hurricane Katrina. It's what's used to respond to wildfires in California. But it also scales way down. You can use it inside your own repository to respond to an emergency. And so it's very effective that way. And it's also effective as a pre-planning tool. If you're planning a big exhibit opening, or you're planning something else that's going to draw crowds of people, you can use ICS as a pre-planning tool. They actually use it to plan the Super Bowl every year. It's that effective. So the incident command system is a temporary management structure that is supercharged, and you use it during times of stress. It is not something you would want to use every day, but it's something you want to use when there's an emergency. So let's talk first about what an incident is, because ICS is meant to respond to an incident. And here again, ICS defines this because they're trying to standardize everything. So an incident is anything that threatens lives, property, or the environment. And property here means your collections. If you're a collecting institution, they're considered property. So anything that threatens lives, property, or the environment is an incident. And every incident requires a response. Now, I like to break the response down into 3 different phases. And this is not precisely an ICS concept, just this one thing, but this is just how I like to think about the responses to an incident. It makes it easier to analyze what happens. So during the initial response, ICS may be used, and I think it should be used, as I'll show you in a minute. During the continuing response, it will be used by the first responders who come to your repository. And it may be used in the recovery phase. I think of that as a 3rd phase. The recovery phase could continue for days or months or even years, depending on how big the incident is. So let's kind of look at each of those real quick. So ICS may inform your initial response. So imagine for a moment, this is an electrical closet. There is water running down the walls here. Imagine if you want that it's a lot more water than that. Imagine too, if there is a collection storage space above this electrical closet. So who's going to initiate the initial response? Well, the answer is pretty easy. It's whoever happens to be present is going to initiate the response. We all know that if you're in a room with other people and something suddenly happens that is a crisis, it's the people there in the room who are present who jump to responding, hopefully, to deal with the crisis. So whoever is present is going to initiate response. And if they've been trained in ICS, they will respond in a very predictable way. And that is especially important if more than one person happens to be present. What you don't want are arguments and indecision. So what ICS says you have to do is you have to assess the situation, identify all the problems you can identify, actual and potential. You need to gauge the significance of each problem, and then you need to tackle the most significant problem first. So assume, in the picture I just showed you, that there is a collection storage space above this electrical closet, and there's water pouring into the electrical closet. My first assumption would be that that water is coming from the storage space above the closet, and that would be a crisis. And so let's say there's more than one person who's present, and they see this, and there could easily be a disagreement about what do we do first? Run upstairs and save the collection? Find an electrician and turn off the power in the electrical closet? What do we do first? So ICS tells you that here's how you identify the most significant problem. The problems are always tackled in this order. The first is life safety. That is always the most significant problem. The second is always incident stabilization. And the third is always property preservation. So the 2 people or 3 people who have discovered this incident, if they understand the ICS system and they understand how to characterize the problems in terms of significance, will immediately understand the first thing is to make sure that we protect lives and that people are safe. So if there's water running into an electrical closet, we'd better find a way to turn off the power before we do anything else, because that's a life safety issue. The second issue is not to run upstairs and start pulling collections out. The second issue is to stabilize the incident, keep it from mushrooming into a bigger incident. And so you need to get the water shut off. That's the first issue. Find where the leak's coming from, turn it off. The third priority is property preservation. Now, if you're like me, that's kind of an issue, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So once you have assessed in this way, you have basically begun to develop a plan. You've assessed, you've classified the problems, you've prioritized the actions, and mentally at least, you've done number 4, 5, and 6 that you see on this slide. You've set some objectives. I need to find somebody to turn off the electricity. The objective is to turn off the electricity. The activity is to find somebody who knows how to do it. And the time frame is as soon as possible. So mentally, you have basically gone through these 6 steps, just in a few seconds probably. And in ICS, these same 6 steps are repeated again and again and are written down ultimately in an incident action plan. If your response continues for any length of time, there will be a written incident action plan. And I tend to think of this in terms of if you had a hurricane come through and you were going to have to recover for 3 or 4 months and you used ICS to do that, you would have an incident action plan that governs every step of that process. Eventually the plan gets written down and it covers a time frame of 1 response period, which might be anywhere from 8 hours to 24 hours. And it gets rewritten or updated every response period so that everybody knows this is what our objective is. This is the activities we're going to do for the next 8 hours or the next 24 hours. Very important that there's a plan. Let's go on with the phases of response. Continuing response is if there's a big enough crisis, there's a fire or something, you're going to have responders who come, firefighters, you could have police officers, you could have ambulance crews. Many people are going to come. And if they don't use ICS, if they don't actually set up an ICS setup with facilities and everything else, they are still going to be using ICS to inform the way they respond. What that means is their first concern is going to be life safety. Their second concern is going to be to stabilize the incident. Their last concern is going to be your collections, because property is the lowest concern. So if you understand how that works, it helps you in a couple of ways. Firstly, if you really understand that, then long before there's a disaster, you're going to go to the responders who are most likely to respond to your cultural facility, and you're going to give them a tour of your facility, and you're going to explain to them what is important to you so that they understand at least that the collections are very important. And they will not let that supersede life safety and such, but they might put somebody on helping preserve the collections while they're stabilizing the incident, for instance, because they understand what you do. The other thing that's going to happen is, even if you haven't done that, when the responders come, you're not going to run out there and try to get them to save your collections immediately, because if you do that, they're going to shut you down at once, because that is not their priority. You need to understand how they think. And so ICS really helps you understand how the responders think. The third phase, as I think of it, is the recovery phase, which could be days or it could be years. Again, think about after a hurricane and your recovery is very long, it's going to be very stressful. And so you need a management structure that can handle that stress. And here you can use ICS to help you do that. Now, let's imagine that you decide to use ICS to help you with your recovery that's going to last for a very long period of time. Here is how ICS might work. Excuse me, you couldn't see me, but I needed a drink of water there. This is the full ICS organization. You are very, very unlikely to ever create a full-blown organization chart like this. ICS is a very modular organization. It expands and contracts as the crisis grows and shrinks. And so I'm just showing you the full-blown setup here. So you understand it could expand all the way to this, but it almost never does in a localized incident of some sort. Everything begins with the appointment of the incident commander, because that's really where everything starts. She or he adds positions as required to the response. So it's very important to understand that the incident commander is not necessarily the boss who in the day-to-day situation. It is the person who is really qualified to direct the response based on what the emergency was, what the incident was. So in Georgia, for instance, I had a head of conservation because we had a conservation lab with a couple of conservators, and I had a head of conservation. Many of you may know Christine Wiseman, who was my head at that time. And if we had an incident that threatened the collections, she became the incident commander, not I. Even though I was in charge of the whole operation, we had to have somebody in charge of the response who understood what needed to happen. And so the incident commander is somebody who is qualified to direct the response, who is not necessarily the person who is the boss during the day-to-day operations. And that's the first person who gets appointed. So sometimes, just so you know, the role of incident commander is filled by a small team. If you had an emergency and you had a fire department, a police department, and other people showing up, they might set up a team that serves as the incident commander, or they might rotate. Maybe the police first appoint the incident commander and then the firefighters do, or whatever. So you can have a team, but normally it's just one person. And it's because ICS says you must have unified command. You have many responders, but there's only one command structure and normally only one incident commander, so that everybody is operating under the same set of objectives and strategies. And that flows into another ICS rule, if you will, and that is chain of command. Every person receives orders from only one direct supervisor. So if the incident commander begins appointing new positions, and we'll talk a little more about that in a moment, each person gets orders only from one direct supervisor. And that's very, very important, because if you have people receiving orders from two different people, then the person who gets the order will decide which of those two orders they should follow. So if I'm just a line worker who's packing wet materials out of a room, and because somebody has ordered me to do that, and somebody else comes along and says, oh, go upstairs and do something else, suddenly I'm not doing what I was told to do. And the person who told me to do that thinks I'm still doing it, and they think that operation is moving along very nicely. And it isn't, because I've decided to follow the other person's command. So chain of command is really important. You receive orders from only one person. Related to that is unity of command. Each person reports to only one supervisor. So all the information about the incident is flowing up to your supervisor and to that person's supervisor and to that person's until it gets up to the incident commander. And the incident commander then is in the best position to make decisions about what should happen next, because all the information flows up. And then when the incident commander gives orders, her orders flow back down through that chain to the people who have to do the actions. So those two principles are extremely important during an ICS response. So how many people does it take to create an ICS structure? Technically, the incident commander could act alone, and you could have one person who is the entire structure, although that doesn't happen usually. The incident commander basically appoints positions as needed. And another principle of ICS is that any position that's left vacant devolves to the person above that position. So if the incident commander appoints an information officer but does not appoint a safety officer or a liaison officer, as you see on this slide, then the incident commander takes on the responsibilities of the safety officer and the liaison officer, because all the positions left vacant devolve upward to the person who is above. So here is in a basic response organization in a very small incident. So you have the commander, you might have a safety officer, and then you might have two sections, and maybe the operations section does most of the work, basically. You've got just a very small organization. How do you know when to expand or contract the organization? Once again, you won't be surprised by now to know that ICS does not leave that to chance. They have what is called span of control, and they tell you what the optimal span of control is. The ideal span of control is one manager for every 3 to 5 workers. ICS allows a span of 1 to 7, but beyond that, ICS says that's not acceptable. So once the organization grows to where you have a span of control that is exceeding 1 to 7, then you start adding positions at the very least. If you look at this chart on the screen, let's say object retrieval. Let's say there are 6 people who are working on object retrieval and there's one person in charge of them. And then you need to add a couple more people. Well, what would happen is those people will be split into at least 2 groups, and each one would have a leader, and then the leader would report up the chain so that no person has more than 7 reports. The incident commander will often appoint command staff and general staff, and that's what this is, the top level hierarchy. The command staff is shown here in the gray boxes, and these people are here to support the incident commander, especially with things that aren't directly related to the response activities themselves. I like to think that these people help manage the response environment rather than the response workers. And sometimes you will see in a chart like this that they will also add a legal officer to this command staff, which is often probably a good idea. So just for instance, the information officer is the person who talks to other people about the incident. That could be the press. It could be internal audiences. Let's say you are a university library, and certainly somebody needs to be briefing the university administration about what's going on with this disaster in the library. The information officer would be the person to do that. And that person has to have the authority to speak for the institution. So if the director of the institution is not the incident commander, as I've already said, this is a really good position for that person to fulfill. They could be the information officer because they can certainly speak for the institution. The safety officer is the person who goes around looking for danger. I like the idea. ICS, again, doesn't leave this to chance. They spell out 15 different hazards that this person is supposed to be looking for and monitoring. And they range from radiation to food poisoning for the response workers. The safety officer looks for hazards everywhere. And so they are generally looking for things like tripping and falling hazards and that sort of thing. But it shows you how systematic and comprehensive the ICS can be. This person also tells people how to get in and out of the response area, especially in a hurricane. If you have routes that could be dangerous, the safety officer would tell people, if you're coming, you have to go this route and that route, and not just any way that you want to get there. The liaison officer is the go-between between the incident commander and other organizations that might help the response. That could be the parent organization, it could be outside organizations. So again, ICS has very strict definitions, and they define outside agencies as either assisting agencies or cooperating agencies. An assisting agency is someone who gives direct assistance. They're going to send a truck over, they're going to send workers over. A cooperating agency is somebody who is just out giving indirect assistance. As I have here, FAIC might be recruiting conservators to help come in and with the response, but they are not actually in doing the assistance. ICS is very strict about this terminology, but again, it's so that there's not confusion when people are talking about what is happening in the situation. So the liaison officer, in a sense, protects the incident commander from all of these groups and funnels all that information to the incident commander on a sort of a need to know basis. The incident commander doesn't need to know who is, what every single assisting agency is doing. The incident commander only needs to know we have 3 assisting agencies and, we're expecting 2 more tomorrow. So all of the command staff positions sort of are there to shield the incident commander from information overload and to help get the information to the incident commander that she or he needs. In the same way, the general staff performs many of those functions, again, of filtering information to the incident commander in digestible form, I guess you would say. So the general staff, unlike the command staff, manages the response workers and the response tasks in a much more direct way. The command staff have the bigger picture view of the environment, whereas the general staff are down in the weeds much more than the command. And here you see a quick chart. I'm sure we'll be supplying you with these slides so you can read them all later. But as you can see here, the operations section is really directing all the people who are going to carry out the incident action plan. The planning section develops that plan, and the logistics section provides the resources. Finance and administration decides how to pay for them all. So the planning chief, I want to start there, is always looking ahead and thinking through what if scenarios. This person needs to know how all the resources are being deployed, what resources are on their way and can be redeployed as needed. And this person is always thinking through, what are we going to do next? What are we going to do next? The operations chief then directs the actual operation, the nuts and bolts of getting the work done. The logistics chief provides the facilities, the transportation, the communication devices, all the different things that are needed to make the response work. And the finance administration chief, of course, is making sure everything gets paid for. Notice that the planning section chief, or the planning section, prepares the incident command or incident action plan, sorry. So early on, I said that even from the initial response, there's a plan formulated. At the time of the initial response, it's a mental plan, not written. But if you're going to use ICS for a long recovery, for instance, there's going to be a written plan. And this is what is included in the plan. What do we want to do? Who's going to do it? What's the time frame, which is normally a few hours to 24 hours? And then how are we going to communicate with each other? How are we going to stay safe during this time? Because now that we know what we're going to try to do, we can identify what are the hazards that are relative to that particular task that we want to accomplish. And so that becomes very important. And how we're going to communicate becomes important. What happens if the radios aren't working or our cell phones aren't going to work? You know, the storm is still going on and there's cell towers are falling down and that sort of thing. How are we going to communicate? And so hopefully you've planned ahead for this and you know that you're going to use couriers or you're going to do something else. But in the incident action plan, you say, okay, in the next 8 hours, this is how we're going to have to communicate because the cell towers aren't up and this is how we're going to do it. It's a very detailed plan. And so the incident action plan is this constant cycle of assessing, classifying, prioritizing, creating objectives, figuring out how we're going to do those objectives and achieve them within a certain time frame. So the cycle repeats and repeats very methodically with very standard briefings and very standard documents. And you can see again why it's probably not the best idea to have the person who is in charge of the institution be the incident commander. Because if you have a 3-month recovery period and you still need to go on with your normal day-to-day work, You need a team that is devoted to the recovery with an incident commander who is just focused on doing this plan over and over again until you come to the conclusion of the recovery. So it's very important. Here are some of the, I want to show you a couple of the forms. Again, ICS is so standardized that they provide forms. You can find these online. This is an operational period briefing form. It even has an agenda for the meeting, and the meetings are very, very brief and succinct. So that's one form they have. Here is another form. This is not an ICS form. This is one from the Pennsylvania Cultural Resilience Network. At least that's where I got it. So I assume they developed it. And it is a basic organization that they use as a team when they go into an incident. If they're called and asked to help a county courthouse that's flooded, for instance, they bring this chart along and they fill this in first. And they name their incident commander, their safety officer, their operations chief, and all that sort of thing. And they have developed other forms that they use to document what they're doing. And they largely do salvage of paper and artifacts. So they've developed this list that they can use to very quickly get organized, and more lists that help them assess collections very rapidly. And here's the last one, an inventory control list that they have. So these forms are very handy in a stressful situation. Here is a practice session we were doing with a big group of people, and they were using these forms to organize their response. And I want to say, we've done this a couple of times, and we've split people into 2 or 3 different groups, and we have them organize the response and then recover the materials in some way. And what happens consistently is that the people who stop and take the time to organize first are always much more successful at their recovery than the people who just jump right in. The people who say, oh, that's getting wet, we got to get it out of there, and just start diving in. What often happens is they run out of room for drying materials. They overlook some materials. And the teams that have really taken time to organize first and talk through how we're going to approach this are always much more successful than other teams. So I just give you that for whatever that's worth. Now, let me just conclude with a quick mention of facilities. The Incident Command System designates specific facilities, each of which has a symbol, of course, because they don't leave anything to chance. And the main facility is the Incident Command Center, which, as you can see here, can be not very elaborate. This is just a corner in a tent at some incident. And it's always designated by that symbol, by the way, but it can also be much more elaborate than what you're seeing here. This is the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, and this is their portable incident command system. So it can be a very, very elaborate place. This is where the incident commander is stationed during the recovery period, or during the incident rather. And this is where everything is basically directed at a tactical level. It comes here at the Incident Command Center. And it is just one of a number of facilities. The B stands for base, the incident base, and that's a location where the primary logistics functions are coordinated. So this is where the logistics chief would be to make sure that supplies are being ordered and received and everything else. And it's important to stage the supplies, for instance, and things in a specific area. And so you have staging areas also that are designated. That's what the S is indicating. And the C is for camps. And camp is a location where food and water and rest are located. It's also where the sanitary services are located. And so that's an important space. And I want to go back a second. When I said staging areas, and I said that's where the supplies are kept, but I made a mistake there. My thoughts did not keep up with my mouth here. I'm sorry. The staging area is where the people are kept who are waiting for assignment. And that can be as simple as just taping off an area that's marked staging area. So if you are responding to an incident, even a small incident, and let's say you have a large room where you are gathering to organize and to do things, it's very helpful to mark off these areas. This over here is the command center. This is the base. This is the camp. This is the staging area. The staging area, for instance, is where you know that people are waiting to be assigned work. If somebody is sitting in the staging area, they're ready to go to work, and that's what they're there for. And so whoever is making the assignments doesn't have to go around asking. They can walk to the staging area and take the 3 people who are sitting there and say, okay, come with me. I'm going to assign you to something. The camp is a very important area, even in a small incident, because that's where people eat and drink. And if you're in a cultural institution, you don't necessarily want all that happening in collection areas. So if you set up a camp someplace and you tell people that's where you have to go to eat and drink, then that helps. So setting up facilities, even if the facility is just one big room, is a very important thing to do. All right, let me talk also for a moment about Emergency Operations Center, which is also often set up during an incident. And most states, emergency management agencies have an EOC, an Emergency Operations Center. And generally, in Pennsylvania, it was the same in Georgia when I was there, state agencies are assigned to the EOC. And what the EOC does not do is manage the response. What they do is they assist and support the incident commander by finding the resources that are needed and making decisions that the incident commander perhaps can't make. And so in Pennsylvania, for instance, if they activate the EOC, the State Archives or the Historical Museum Commission has a seat in the EOC, and we would send a person there. And at the incident site, the incident commander would say, okay, we have wet records here. So the incident commander would tell the EOC, we have wet records, we need assistance on what to do with them. And our person in the EOC would say, okay, we will take care of that. They would contact the archives, they'd contact our network response people, and we would come back to the EOC and say, okay, we have 3 teams that could come tomorrow to deal with this. They would tell the incident commander, and that would be the resource the incident commander needed. So requests flow up to the EOC, or the Executive Policy Group, as it's sometimes called. Resources and decisions flow back down to the incident commander, who remains in charge of the response at all times. Now, eventually, the response does end, and the incident ends, and it's very important, I think, to have an after-action report. ICS requires an after-action report, and it sometimes happens a couple months after the end of the response. But it's a place where the people who were involved in the response can sit down and record lessons learned. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What do we need to fix so that the next time this happens, we're readier than we were? And again, you can do that within your own institution, even if you have a minor incident. Many years ago, the first dripping sprinkler that I had in my archives, I learned that I needed to keep plastic sheeting really handy and not have to run all over the building looking for it. And so, and this was back when I was the only archivist. And so I learned from that. And we can all learn from every incident. And so an after action report is really very important. And hopefully the recommendations get revisited until they actually get implemented. I also think that it's very helpful for all the employees to learn ICS in some way. And they don't need to learn every detail of it. But for instance, I started this with decision making. How do you decide what's the highest priority when you're faced with an incident? And every employee should learn that so that they're all on the same page when it happens. And so you can train your employees, and you can train them also to understand, if we have emergency responders who come to our facility, this is how they're going to be thinking. And so we want everybody to understand that. And so you can train the employees, you can practice with it. You can use it for even a response that doesn't really need a full-blown ICS setup, don't waste it. Use it anyway. Set up the ICS anyway, just to train yourselves and to learn. And of course, you can use it to plan a major event. If you're doing an exhibit opening or something, why not use the ICS as a way to manage the planning for that major event and to manage it while it's going on. It's a good way to learn. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but let me just remind you, the incident command system is a temporary supercharged management structure that you implement during times of stress. It supersedes the normal management structure, and it's temporary. It goes away eventually, but it's a very, very useful tool. And on that note, I'm going to try to find my Zoom and stop sharing. Here we are.
So I'm going to ask everyone if you have any questions to please type them into the chat box at this point. And David, thank you so much. That was really very.
Oh, Michelle, you got muted.
We know it was very something, but we don't know what it was.
All right, there we go. I'm clicking on and off all these buttons, and I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. So, you know, that was really fascinating, and I think a very clear layout of everything to do about the incident command system, because when you start looking at those charts, I mean, they can be really very, very confusing, especially that first one you put up with, you know, for a big incident with all those breakdowns. You know, they can be very confusing. So I think that was a really great, clear discussion of what the incident command system is. And I also would like to point out that if you're really interested in this, for those that are listening, I know that FEMA has an online free course on the incident command system. And there are two variations of that. One is sort of short and quick to introduce you to it. And you can sort of flip through the slides. And I forget if there's actually exercises or not, but that's for sort of general understanding. But there's also, I believe, a course where you can receive certification, and that'll really go into, you know, the depth of the system, and will require you to have, you know, a great deal of knowledge about it if you're interested in having that kind of a certification. So
actually many courses they offer, and there's ICS 100 and 200 and 300 and 400, and so you can take whichever, and it's all online at your own speed. You can take whichever one you want to do. But I should mention one other thing, because even though ICS is sort of a unified system, there are slight variations to it that different groups use. There's sort of a medical emergency ICS, and there are other kinds. But if you go to the FEMA site, you'll find the basic ICS, which is what you probably want to start with.
What I thought was interesting about your talk was, and because I never thought of it, was how you apply it at your own institution. Like you mentioned an exhibit, something like that, or even a performance. You know, I didn't realize they used it at the Super Bowl, but I thought that was interesting that you could take your own institution and see how, with whatever events you're doing or programming or whatever, that you can apply that management structure into your own institution. And I think that's just a really great thing to do. I'll get to a couple questions in a minute, but I believe you sent me a document that you also would like to send out afterwards. Do you recall there was a document?
As my grandfather used to say, I've slept since then. So
well, I'm afraid to, what I'm afraid to do is close out of here to go look it up on my home screen, and then it'll be gone forever. But I remember you sent me the slides, and you sent me a document you said to send out afterwards.
yes, I sent you a PDF of the slides,
Mm-hmm.
and then the link to the book.
Okay.
The discounted price. So I sent you both of those. And let me just back up a second. Something you said to sort of piggyback on that. Yes, you can use it in your own institution. And I suspect many of the people who are on this webinar are also part of a response team. And in Pennsylvania, I think they have found that if they use the ICS for their team, it really helps them because all the team members may be coming from different kinds of repositories, different structures. And if you use ICS, again, it supersedes what everybody's familiar with and gives them all common ground for working together.
Great. Okay, so let me get over to the chat box now. I'm just going to go down the list. So from Tyler, Tyler says, will you be sharing the Homeland Security Incident Command System links that provide formal training on this system? They have a great learning page for the system. This is where the NPS, a former employer of his, trained us. So I'm not quite sure what that is. Is that the same as the FEMA?
Yeah, probably if someone were to do a Google search on the FEMA training,
comes right up.
And
so, I'm sorry, Tyler, if you just do the incident command FEMA links, you can FEMA and Google, like David said, you're going to be able to. It'll come up right away. I don't have those links handy, although I can try to find them afterwards. Bethany asks, what is the best way to get your emergency responders to your facility? I have a hard time getting them to take the time to come over to the museum.
I have found that chocolate chip cookies work wonderful. And while yes, I mean, I say that jokingly, but it's also true. If you can get people to come, tell them, you know, we want to honor the responders, and we've got some refreshments, and we want to give you a tour of our building at the same time. You'll probably get some people to come, and often that's the first thing to have happen. What often happens is a couple of people come, and then they go back to the other responders and say, hey, this was nothing like I expected. This was really cool. You need to come and see this. For me, and depending on your situation, it helps when you're a state archives, because if you go to the fire chief or somebody like that, they tend to respond to you. And I just go and explain, you know, I understand how you work. I want you to understand that my collections are very important, and that there could come a day when you may not be able to save all of our collections. Let's say we had a fire, God forbid. I want you to understand what is most important to me. And then I want to hear from you how I can help you deal with that in a crisis. And I've had people say to me, well, you know, if you could mark those particular boxes with big red stickers or something, so that if we came in a crisis, we would know this is what we need to get out of here. We've only got, 30 minutes. This is what we grab. Or if you could move those closer to a door so that we could get them out the back if we needed to. And so if you go in with the attitude that I want to learn from you, I think mostly they respond very well.
I see. Fred Pacman. Hi, Fred. Fred put the link in there to the FEMA training. So thank you, Fred, for that. Couple of comments. Great job, David. Perhaps the best, clearest presentation of ICS I've ever heard. And I totally agree, Tyler. Bethany says that the Alaska State Museum instituted ICS when they moved their museum and built a new storage area and museum. It was interesting to be part of that system as they planned, packed, and moved the museum. Many of us came from various institutions and were able to work together. And I think there are some questions in the Q&A. Let's see. Nope, they were all from Bethany. About how to get the emergency responders to tour your facility, and she says they're all about food. So yes, they did. That's absolutely true. And I was trying to Google something real quick here that I wasn't able to get to, unfortunately. But I remember years ago, and maybe somebody on the listening in will recall here. The IMLS funded a program in Massachusetts for their archives and state library, I believe. And I cannot think of the name of it right now. No, it's not COSTEP. But at any rate, it was specifically about how to work with emergency management. And they put out a great booklet about how to do it. And remember, the booklet was one side was for cultural institutions and flip it over, and the other side was for the emergency management, telling them how to work with cultural institutions. And towards that end, they also put out a big poster, I remember, about how to get emergency management into your facility so that you can, talk about that. Oh, Finding Common Ground, somebody said was the name of the program.
And that's where I got the cookies idea, by the way, was from that poster.
Okay. So do you recall I'm sure that's still online somewhere, but do you recall the name of that?
I do not recall, but I'm sure it's still online, and FAIC may have a link to it, because I'm pretty sure they worked with Heritage Preservation, and FAIC has
Yes.
a lot of that. So I'm sure they have the link out there, but it was a very good poster, and I'm fairly certain that is where I got the cookies idea, because it is all about food.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think it's FAIC probably transitioned over for the materials, and it might have been part of the original Connecting to Collections.
I think somebody just put it in the chat now. Looks like
Cultural Health and Resources Emergency. Great. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody. And I just love it when everybody's so on the ball in the chat that I don't even have to do. I don't even have to do any work. So, I want to just say, is there any other further questions or comments for David before we put up that final slide?
While people are thinking, let me give a shout out to Alaska, the State Museum, the Library and Archives. They were one of the first, I think, to look at ICS and how to apply it within an institution. Because back when I was first starting on this, and I think when I first wrote the book, and they contacted me, and I was very happy they did. And I think they had a very successful move, I hope.
I think someone from Alaska contacted me about actually wanting to share this webinar with them. They were very interested. So as I had mentioned to you before, we had a lot of email and interest from a number of different states. So that was really great. And I'm going to give a shout out to Lori Foley for introducing me to you, connecting us together. So I really appreciate Lori's work on that. We've been, again, working together between with Lori Foley, with FEMA, and also with the Conservation Center for Arts and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, which I, did the forums probably for the workshops that you were doing, and they've been with us since the very beginning of NJCAR, way back in 2011, 2012 area. So somebody asked, will we be getting some confirmation from you showing that we attended this webinar? So Frank, are looking for I guess a confirmation would be if you would get the slides and the link to the recording. But if are you looking for some sort of a CE certificate? That's not something that we typically give out. So you can put that in the chat box if that's something that you need or what exactly you would require from us. Naomi, at this point, would you put up, please, the last slide that is going to comment box saying that, thank you and what a great program that you did have done for us here today. So here is David's book, and there's the link. And also, I want to encourage you from what Mary Eileen Forat said in the beginning to please like us on Facebook, NJCAR. We do have a website. You can always contact me at the State Library for our upcoming programs. So May 6th, we're going to have the Monuments Men talk from Corey Wegener. And so I hope you'll join us for that. And David, unless there's any further comments, I want to check the chat one more time. Thank you for a great program, excellent presentation, very informative and much appreciated. This was a great program. So David, it was a great program. And it took us a while to finally connect for this, but I want to thank you so much for coming today
Thank
and
you.
giving this presentation. It was well worth our time, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you, and and thanks to the organizers for this event. You're welcome. I always like to try to put on a great informative program that is full of content and not much fluff, and we sure got that today, David. So thanks very much, and folks, I hope you all have a great afternoon and stay safe. Same to you, David. Have a great afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. Bye, everyone.